Welcome to Leveraging the Changing Workforce with your hosts, Hyman Alberton and KT, Catherine Tarantino of Genesis Consulting Group.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for spending time with myself, KT, Catherine Tarantino, Hyman Alberton, my business partner, and of course, our invited guest, Dave Daniels with Dave Daniels Consulting. We're going to talk about, and this is going to be, we're trying to create a series, but we're going to talk about how to optimize an intergenerational workforce. And I have a few questions around that I think are probing and appropriate. First of all, is this conversation about generational differences in the workplace truly necessary? Do we even need to have this conversation? And how would you describe an intergenerational workforce? Gentlemen?
KT, this is Dave, and I think it's an excellent question. And I go back to when I was a regional VP for McDonald's and my first meeting with my franchisees and my staff, and that was about 25, 30 years ago. And we covered the topic of Generation X versus Y, which was a really big topic at the time. And I remember the dialogue, and I remember my thoughts to the group at that point. And my answer to them is I asked the same question. And my point of view is that I felt that the golden rule, which for me was treating others the way they wanted to be treated or the way you wanted to be treated, worked many times and in most situations and most relationships. And I felt it was important to understand some nuances. And I felt that it was a good conversation to have, but just common sense golden rule would get you through 98% of the situations. Well, so I reflect back, and was there much conversation? And it certainly did start to generate some conversation at the time, but I'm not sure how much it resonated 25, 30 years ago, because we don't hear a whole lot about it until fairly recently. So why are we talking about it? And do I feel differently today? And the answer is yes. I think a lot of things have changed in the world. I believe the average workforce and the work situation is much more complex. And I think it's much more nuanced today than it was in the past. And something that I've tried to challenge myself to evolve to is to go from the golden rule to what I call the platinum rule. So what's the difference? Again, the golden rule is you're treating others the way you want to be treated. The platinum rule is that you're treating people the way they want to be treated. And I think there's a real significance in that. In my whole perspective and my whole goal is to help leaders bring the best out of each one of the people in their organization. And that can be very, very powerful. I have had we've talked about this a little bit in the past podcast. I've had the good fortune of being a certified coach in the IDI leadership assessment, and I've done over 500 one-on-one sessions with leadership from all different size organizations. And I found that this kind of individual one-on-one kind of conversation to be very powerful.
Okay, Dave, I'm going to backpedal a minute. You talked about the golden rule and the platinum rule. Mm-hmm. Can you walk us through and raise our knowledge, our awareness? You said treat people how they want to be treated, and there's a significant difference in that.
There is. If you go back to 25, 30 years ago, workforces were much more homogenous at that time. And if I treated somebody the way I wanted to be treated, I probably had a pretty good shot at being able to connect with that person and build an effective relationship, both from a business and personal perspective, to help optimize the productivity from those employees. Today, it's become much more complicated and it's become much more diverse. And I believe that's a positive because I think that homogeneous approach had its limitations. And we have found through a much more diverse workforce today that there's some real advantages to that. And so to be able to just simply reach out to a person that works for you, whatever level of leadership that you're in, and to say, how do you want to be treated? How do you want to be managed? How do you want to be led? And have that conversation. And the very first time that you meet with that new direct report can be very powerful.
Excellent. Hyman, take that a little further, if you may, as to what you do with clients.
Thanks for the question, KT. And to answer that question specifically, as you know, we coach a lot of different industries. It's one of the things that I do when I am meeting with a client. One is at today's point, how do you determine whether or not you're using the gold rule versus the platinum rule? And I start my conversations by not only greeting the person, but also start by asking them one simple question. How do you want to be called? Do you want to be called KT? Do you want to be called Catherine? Do you want to be called Kathy? And I ask because I don't want to make assumptions about what a person and how a person they want to be referred to. So I ask that question of clarification, and then I also share with them how I would like to be referred to during the engagement that we're going to have. That way, it gets us somewhat fact. I'm not making assumptions; they're not making assumptions, and I have permission to use the name that they're asking that I use. And so that sort of helps to get us off on a good relative to the overall engagement that we're going to take place in. I also try to understand what are some nuances that I may need to be aware of, particularly when it comes to their industry, their culture. And although you could have the same companies in the same industry, it doesn't necessarily mean that they behave the same way. So I try to understand on protocols in their organizations that can try to utilize those as much as I possibly can relative to the engagement.
Excellent. Hyman, we are in agreement that this is a necessary
Mhm.
conversation, that managing the intergenerational workforce is important. Can you please describe what you mean by an intergenerational workforce? What does that mean?
An intergenerational workforce is one where proactive and intentional effort has been put in place to develop what we would consider a high quality relationships, beneficial interactions, and productive collaborations between colleagues, regardless as to age or what, say, generation they fall into. So, long story short, you're putting together individuals from different generations for specific purposes of engagement relative to completion of project initiatives or strategic strategies.
Walk us through some of your thoughts in the area of specifically demographics.
Before I get into the question of answering the demographic piece, let me just want to add something that Dave mentioned, and some context will then lead into some things I want to share relative to the graphics. First and foremost, though, I really concur with Dave's point of view and comments around the importance of effective interactions, with one another. And it's more critically important today that companies have effective production interactions amongst their employee base for several reasons. And let me just give you a couple of what those reasons are from my perspective. One is that business is more complex, it's more dynamic, it's rapidly evolving, probably more so today than any time during the, say, Industrial Revolution. And that goes back for quite some time. But business has really picked up the pace and is ever evolving, going from one stage to the next. A second is that work is more knowledge based today. That's requiring more effective communication skills. And those skills help you to really understand and apply the knowledge that you have. So you need to understand the fact that are changing, but how you stay on top of that, how you keep your organization maybe on one platform or underneath one umbrella is to have communications around that. And then when you look at the fact that there's at least five, I won't go into them right now, five workforce generations, and we all have our differences. We have our differences in terms of values, we have our differences in terms of communications, we have our differences in terms of things that influence how we do and what we do. And so it's critically important, again, that we sort of have that context. And then the other last thing that I'll say before I get into the generations is just the fact that communication platforms and channels are varied today, more so than they were early during the 19th century, as an example. And so we have a variety of means of communicating channels and platforms that requires us to be able to utilize those to be effective within the workplace. Just wanted to share that.
Hyman, can I just interrupt you for a minute on the level of
Yes.
communications? Do you remember when Warren Buffett was facilitating and he was talking about college and earning a degree? His emphasis was what you just said. Work is knowledge, and you have to have outstanding communication skills.
Yes.
And he just pounded and raised your awareness that it is about communication. And as both you and Dave are talking about the spread of communication today from our traditional 30 years ago, listen, you sat across the hall from your boss. You weren't texting, you weren't on some kind of, I mean, really, right?
Yes.
It was in that, let's not even use the word cubicle that we all, many of us grew up in. And fortunately, some of those environments have evolved. But I just really need to understand when you talk about work as knowledge and communication. And that helped me
Hmm.
for the necessity of this conversation.
And when we look at communication platforms, one of the things that, I'll share, which is an evolution of how we communicate, was, back during the early reign of the Industrial Revolution, communications was face to face. And so you had that one-on-one, face-to-face conversation with people. Okay, probably where you were able to gain a little bit more intimacy in those conversations. And then think about it, that migrated from, say, face-to-face conversations to the advent of telephone. And so with that, you had another way of communicating besides having to be face-to-face. You had that. And then you had the evolution from that to things like fax machines that came into play in emails. And now we have the multi channels of technology when you look at smartphones, when you look at social media. So there's been such an evolution of communication platforms that, is really requires you to sort of understand, okay, which of those platforms are appropriate at any point in given time relative to having a productive, effective conversation, and understanding who your audience is, whether or not it's an individual or group, and how do you best communicate with them. So I just wanted to share that.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, KT, we're going to be putting some links in this podcast for the great research that Hyman's talking about. So there's some excellent information in general about that. And it's a great place to start. And there's some really good research that's been done, far better than was done 25 years ago. The one thing that I've noticed, though, is there's differences within differences. And so that's a great place to start, but there's differences within differences. And that's why I find it so effective to be able to sit down on a one-on-one basis with your direct reports and have that conversation. I thought Hyman gave some great examples of how to approach that. My approach is to ask people to come prepared, to define the difference between a manager and a leader. And then I ask them to come prepared to talk about how they like to be managed and how they like to be led. And then we have that conversation back and forth. We look for hopefully a lot of common ground, but then we look for some nuances that potentially could be problems. So we try to address that proactively. And we use that as a foundation in the relationship on an individual and a group perspective moving forward.
Say that again for us, Dave. Differences are
There's differences within differences. So if
Difference.
you take a
Yes.
look at the 5 generations, and there's some great broad information there. I mean, it's really good, robust information, and I encourage people to look at it and digest it. With that
And
said, my experience is that there are differences within those differences.
Yes.
And so getting to know a person individually and what makes them tick, and that's to the platinum rule, then that can become much more robust and much more effective, because now I'm not making assumptions that because you fit into this group, this is the way I should treat you and lead you and manage you.
well said. And you're
Yeah.
referring to the generational work preferences that
Yes.
was authored by Corn Ferry. Our facilitator has that. It will be a part of our deliverable. So it will help you definitely. And Hyman, can you walk us through the 4 or 5 different categories?
So let's talk about then. I'm going to use sporting terminology right now, but let's look at who's on the team. Currently, we have 5 different generations, workforce generations on the team. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about them, but I just want to share some information on them. So, one is what we call the silent generation. Those are individuals that were born between 1925 and 1945. You have the baby boomers who were born between 1940, say 46 to 1964. You have your Gen X, those individuals born 1965 through 81. And then you have your millennials, which were born between 1982 and 2000. But the 5th generation that we have, that we haven't, that I want to add into the mix, and although the numbers aren't very quantifiable yet, is the Alpha generation. And those are these individuals born after 2010. So when you look at that group, that vastness in terms of generations and years of experience and what people have evolved with in industry over the last 50 some odd years, longer, it's more than 50 some odd years, that's a large group that you have to try to have a sense of understanding and understanding their influences, their values, their characteristics. And today's point, although you may have multiple people from a generation in the workplace, it doesn't mean that our experiences are all the same. Our knowledge base may not be all the same. So we have to really be very, I'm going to say, intentional around developing a relationship of engagement and communications with our clients so that they feel that they can speak up and be forthright about their experiences.
So it gets back to that differences within differences. Dave, any other
Yes.
thoughts that you have?
Yeah, just the only other thought, because I think everybody's brought up some really good points, is that one of the things that I have a concern about, that we've talked about as a group quite a bit, is that there is a dwindling emphasis of at least formalized training for emotional intelligence going on in today's business world. And with that said, I think that's an unfortunate trend that needs to be reversed, because there's certainly some strong evidence that that kind of training and development can be very effective as part of your leadership growth. Is that what we're talking about here with regards to the differences of intergenerational and all that, and understanding that in a group level, but also an individual level, can be a very powerful part of your growth as an individual, as a leader today, and becoming more effective, especially in the absence of a lot of emotional intelligence training in organizations.
And I'm going to take that a little further. The emotional intelligence, and you're right, there might be a lack of awareness and a commitment to really believe in its value. And what we're finding also with staff and clients is establishing expectations. And we know expectations rather than age define workplace behavior. Clear expectations of what's expected, your level of awareness, how you're going to get support. These clear expectations rather than age, give it X, millennial, Z, or alpha, really, really define workplace behaviors.
So, KT, if I may interject real fast to your point on expectations, and based upon my experience working with recent clients, and this isn't putting everyone in the same box. However, a number of clients that I've worked with, regardless as to level within the organization, have indicated that there's been lack of clarity, there's been lack of conversation regarding the expectations of individuals and what it is that their manager or the organization would like for them to achieve, what timeline, what outcomes they're looking for. And so, although we know that expectations and setting expectations is critically important, it seems to be a step that is being overlooked in some organizations today. And so the question then becomes, how do we help clients better understand, okay, what the organization expects of them? And how do they engage in their managers if their manager hasn't come to them? How do they engage their managers in terms of clarifying and asking for the expectations that they're expected to deliver at any given point in time?
So, what quick tip do you have for me when a client or a staff member, team member, what quick tip can you share for me to initiate and try to
Mhm.
close this gap of no expectations or vague
Right.
expectations for, the expectation that's not communicated, but of course you
Right.
understand.
So one of the things that I encourage clients to do is that if they have a meeting with their manager or someone in leadership and they are being provided a project, a task that they want to have completed, if they don't feel that they have sufficient information prior to leaving that meeting, that they stop and they ask the manager or they ask the individual to allow them to clarify some things to make sure that what they have heard and what they are taking away as expectations is actually what the manager or the individual intended for them to take away. So clarifying what is the project, what is the timeline for delivery, what outcomes are you looking for, and so you have to be willing to engage in dialogue with that individual and not be afraid or ashamed that if you walk away and you haven't asked those questions, that okay, if you want to ask questions of clarity, that you're going to be frowned upon. You're less likely to be frowned upon and more likely to be thanked for asking for clarification rather than concluding the meeting and you don't have a clue as to what it is you're supposed to be doing.
Well said. Okay, I'm going to take a moment here to just wrap things up, and I appreciate both of you and your time and for convincing me that this is a necessary conversation, how to optimize intergenerational workforce and to really embrace, I'm going to say, the platinum rule, the platinum approach. Talk to me, ask me how I like to be treated, how I like to communicate instead of assuming that or that one approach fits all. And I'm going to capitalize on the term, Dave, again, differences within differences. It's an important concept and term for us to think about. Okay, some good takeaways. And I want to invite everyone to listen to this, and we will be evolving to another series about how we work best and really leveraging how concepts on working models and how we work best with technology integration. And then we will also be discussing in our future building relationships and mentoring and reverse mentorship models. We are grateful that you took time to listen to this intergenerational conversation in the workforce. Please check in with igenesisgroup.com, Dave Daniels Consulting, and lean on us. Lean on us for our perspective and our ability to help you think through some complex ideas. And we look forward to hearing from you, and we are thankful that you listened.